away, roughly 3 weeks away from the anniversary. And what struck me this morning, kind of thinking about this, was the Americans have moved past it, the Europeans are still dealing with it, and the Asians never felt it. Is that a reasonable way of dividing up the world?
I think that, at first cut, that makes perfect sense. The impact on Europe was just so much more prolonged, and you were citing the Deutsche Bank stock this morning. I mean, that's an unimaginable situation 10 years ago, the Deutsche trading at less than $10 a share. I mean, this is an incredible situation. If you think about the Italian banks still limping along, and those fundamental unresolved fiscal issues and governance issues within the Eurozone, which were burst into the open in 08, already in 08 really, it didn't take until 10, it was already clear in 08 the Eurozone did not have a comprehensive fix for its banking problems. Asia, on the other hand, powers through with this massive stimulus. And the question there, of course, in China is, can they engineer any kind of soft landing? They're dealing, if you like, with the huge side effects of the very potent medicine that they took to drive them through what was otherwise a really dangerous fall in their exports. The US, I think, is the most ambiguous one of all of these stories. And it's the one where the metastasization of the crisis into a political drama is, of course, also the daily news every moment. Because if you ask Americans whether the crisis is still with us, if you look at Wall Street, you look at the S&P 500, the answer is evidently no. And there's always the tech story that makes everyone feel better all the time. But then on the other hand, you have Trump. And Trump is seen, if you like, as the kind of political symptom that the crisis ultimately produced. The disaffection, the inequalities, the sense of resentment deep in American society, where things really didn't work out quite as well as they did for those who were bailed and those who the benefits of QE were really most effective for.
Were there policy mistakes? It's interesting you talk about Trump, and in some ways here in Europe we look at the United States and think that they made fewer policy mistakes than we did. Is that a fair reflection? Because yes, America is dealing with Trump, but Europe is dealing with Brexit. It's dealing with Italy. I don't know what happens in Germany next, but Merkel she feels on very thin ice right now. Yeah. And we look at the policy mistakes and how they've worked out. Yeah. Is it possible to kind of talk about policy mistakes, and can we again divide the world along those lines?
It's really tempting, and on the other hand, you feel like, I think, an appropriate sense of modesty. The situation that folks were dealing with in the first couple of weeks of September were like nothing anyone had ever seen before in global history. This was faster, bigger, more comprehensive. And these are very intelligent, highly motivated, energetic people. So mistake is perhaps not the right word, but decisions which in retrospect look as though we would have gone a different way. And Lehman is the obvious one. Why did they let it go? On the other hand, having made that mistake, the Americans are really energized, having really looked over the bridge.
TARP, all these things
and you get to October 13th and the comprehensive recapitalization of the big American banks, and that's really the dividing of the ways, because that's the thing that doesn't happen in Europe. And that's really, I think, the fundamental difference, because at the bottom of the Eurozone crisis is the weakness in the financial system itself, which makes restructuring very dangerous and makes the turbulence in the bond market so dangerous because of the sovereign bank doom loop scenario. And so that, I think, is really the parting of the ways. It comes quite early, and it comes after what we might think of as the original big American mistake. That energizes them and creates the political space to do something that no one in Europe really ever managed to do.
You draw a lot of lines to what is happening politically, and you've just done that. You talk about Trump. Brexit is obviously another kind of reaction. The policy story that was developed by the ECB and how that changed the employment situation in Europe, and how that then generated a migration story which the UK had to deal with. When we look at kind of what happens next, I think this is probably what a lot of people are now thinking about. Where are we? Right. What are the comparisons? We look at the rise of populist governments, we look at the rise of far-right governments, and you start to compare the situation with the 1930s, and that is a worrying story to think about.
Yeah, so specifically, I think the most critical problem at the moment is the GOP. It's the Republican Party. Right. It's the fracture within that party.
It's still in the States.
It's absolutely, that still is the anchor of the entire system, because it's insofar as we have a dollar-based global financial system, in the end, it all comes down to the political environment of the Fed and the US Treasury. They are the anchor institutions of the global system. In 08, the crisis fighting was carried politically, despite the fact that this was a Republican administration. This was the Bush administration in an election year, months away from an election, reason, they cannot whip their own people in Congress into line to bail Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This is not some investment bank. This is the pillar of middle-class home ownership in the United States. The Republicans won't give their own president the vote. If you're looking for a moment when the GOP becomes a party of protest rather than a party of government, that moment there, I think, really encapsulates it. And that really then, going forward, is the big question for global economic governance. Is the United States still a cooperative player in the game? Will it still be able, for instance, to cooperate with China if China comes under really massive pressure the way it did in 1516?
So let's compare and contrast. You've got the situation in the United States, you've got this protest party, you've got President Trump as notionally the head of that, and you've got China trying to engineer a soft landing.
Yeah.
How do those two interact?
I mean, it's really, really worrying, I think. Because if you look back to 1516, that was that critical moment when all of a sudden it looked like the China boom was going to break and break bad. And at that moment, the Fed was thinking about the beginning of the taper. Yellen had the decision to make in that September of 15 whether to raise interest rates, and she does not. And she goes public and explicitly justifies this in terms of global credit conditions. The Fed internalized China as part of its decision-making process. 2 years, 3 years on, we've got a president who tweets celebratory about the collapse of the Shanghai stock market, seeing it as a symptom of the success of his trade war against China. Those are two very different political environments for dealing with what now is the critical dynamic link in the global economy between the US and China.
Is everything in the same bucket now? For Trump and the Chinese in certain ways, the sort of Clausewitz and kind of the sort of everything's on a spectrum here, but it's all in play.
That's
at this
another
point.
thing I think that we see in 2008, and remember this is the anniversary not just of the financial crisis but the war in Georgia, where Putin actually fronted up and stopped NATO in its tracks. Now Putin's a small player in the global economy, but that's indicative, I think, of the way in which geopolitics, which was held at bay in the aftermath of the Cold War, so everything wasn't in play. You could separate power politics, which the West had won, from economics, which the West was also winning. And so basically the gods of economic growth were on our side and we could relax. That set of assumptions, those divisions between politics, geopolitics, economics, all of those have really got into the melting pot. And right now it's explicitly American national security strategy to treat economics and tech as just a part of a continuum of arenas in which they compete.
The military?
Military as well, yeah. It goes smoothly from tech by way of trade to hard power as a continuum of force, if you like, in dealing with the Chinese.
Is the multilateral world toast?
Well, what we're heading towards is certainly something that's multipolar. I mean, that can still have elements of multilateralism, but it might be more regional. It's very difficult, I think, to imagine any of the big encompassing global institutions functioning in the way that we thought they might in the 90s. Admittedly, of course, even in the 90s, they weren't necessarily the easiest things to make go. The trade round at Doha failed well before Trump came on the scene.
Yep.
And we'd moved to powerful, deep integration at a regional level as a substitute.
If Trump is a one-term president, do we go back?
Well, this is the question, yeah.
What happened?
Everyone in the world henceforth has to reckon, and this is why I emphasise the GOP and not Trump, with the fact that one of the two parties in the American political system has stood by and watched Trump as he engaged in this kind of activity. They produced Trump, and they were the party which also held the American government budget hostage in 2011 at the middle of maximum Eurozone stress. Right? America gets a downgrade because they can't get the budget through. And in 2013, they shut down the government. So that party, until we see, I think, structural change within that party, it seems to me that the world will be unwise to assume that the United States is really a reliable geo-economic player.
Where does that leave Europe? What happens next in Europe?
Well, one answer from the European side is to say, like Heiko Maas, the German foreign minister, did a couple of days ago, we need our own payment system so we can protect ourselves against sanctions, we can be serious about the EMF. And broadly speaking, as a pro-European, I thoroughly agree with that, and that might be one of the good things to come out of the standoff with Trump. But one of the messages of 2008 is you cannot kid yourself about the all-pervasive significance of the dollar in the global system. The Europeans are really kidding themselves if they think they can substantially insulate themselves from that. Because it affects not just that, but the EMs, after all, who've gone deeper and deeper into a reliance on the dollar as their main basis for offshore borrowing and lending. That's what we're seeing in Turkey, that's what we see in Japan as well, where the banks have really gorged on cheap dollar funding. And we've discovered in 2015, 2016 that private sector in China had huge amounts of dollar funding too, because it was cheap and it was an easy carry trade, so why not, right? So that is something which a little bit of tinkering around the edges and 50 billion euros in an EMF or whatever it is the Germans will finally concede, that's not the right order of magnitude, right? In terms of liquidity provision to the global system, we're talking multiple trillions. Those are the kind of reserves that the Asian central banks hold. I don't see any political will in Europe for that kind of thing.